cerebellum. Now, let's begin our discussion with the cerebellum. The cerebellum is the largest part of the hindbrain, and after the cerebrum, it is actually the second largest part of the brain. Now, where exactly is it located? The cerebellum sits in the posterior cranial fossa. It lies just above the foramen magnum and just below the occipital and temporal lobes of the brain. It is also covered by a fold of dura mater called the tentorium cerebelli. If we look at a sagittal section of the brain, we can clearly see the cerebellum in relation to its surrounding structures. One important point to remember is that the cerebellum is separated from the pons and the medulla by the fourth ventricle. Now let us quickly revise its relations. Superiorly, it is related to the tentorium cerebelli. Anteriorly, we find the fourth ventricle, the pons, and the medulla. And posteriorly, it is related to the squamous part of the occipital bone. Now that we know the location and relations of the cerebellum, let us move on to its external features. The cerebellum is made up of two large cerebellar hemispheres, and these two hemispheres are united in the midline by a narrow structure called the vermis. Let's look at the surfaces of the cerebellum. On the superior surface, the two hemispheres are continuous with each other, giving it a smooth appearance. On the inferior surface, there is a deep median notch called the vallecula cerebelli. Next, we come to the notches of the cerebellum. The anterior cerebellar notch provides space for the midbrain and pons. On the other hand, the posterior cerebellar notch lodges a fold of dura mater known as the falx cerebelli. The cerebellum is also divided by several important fissures. The horizontal fissure is the largest one, and it separates the superior surface from the inferior surface. Then we have the primary fissure, which lies between the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe of the cerebellum. And finally, the posterolateral fissure, which separates the small flocculonodular lobe from the rest of the cerebellum. Now, let us carefully look at the subdivisions of the vermis. As we already know, the vermis is the narrow central part of the cerebellum that connects the two hemispheres. Anatomically, it is divided into three major lobes: the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe, and the flocculonodular lobe. Each of these lobes contains smaller parts or subdivisions. Let's begin with the anterior lobe. Here, we find three structures. Right at the very front lies the lingula. Just behind it, we see the central lobule. And following that, a prominent raised part, known as the culmen. Next, we move on to the posterior lobe, which has the largest number of subdivisions. From front to back, these are the declive, the folium, the tuber, the pyramid, and finally, the uvula. And lastly, the smallest lobe of the cerebellum, the flocculonodular lobe. The vermis here contains a small but very important structure called the nodule. Now that we have understood the subdivisions of the vermis, let us move one step further and see their lateral extensions into the cerebellar hemispheres. Remember, the vermis is the midline structure of the cerebellum, and each of its parts has a corresponding extension on either side into the hemispheres. Together, they form well-defined anatomical units. Let's begin with the anterior lobe. Here, the vermis has three parts: the lingula, the central lobule, and the culmen. The lingula does not have any prominent lateral extension. The central lobule, however, extends laterally as the alae. The culmen extends into the hemispheres as the quadrangular lobule. Next, we move to the posterior lobe, which is much larger and more complex. The declive of the vermis continues laterally as the simplex lobule. The folium extends into the superior semilunar lobule. The tuber is connected laterally with the inferior semilunar lobule. The pyramid extends into the biventral lobule. And finally, the uvula of the vermis is flanked on either side by the tonsils of the cerebellum. Lastly, we have the flocculonodular lobe. Here, the vermis contains the nodule, which extends laterally as the flocculus. Now let us explore the internal structure of the cerebellum. This image shows us a horizontal section of the cerebellum, along with the medulla at the level of the olive. The cerebellum, just like the cerebrum, has a very characteristic arrangement. On the outside, we find a layer of grey matter, which forms the cerebellar cortex. Beneath that lies the white matter, which forms the inner core. When we take a midline cut through the cerebellum, we can clearly see the vermis. On either side, the section also shows the tonsils of the cerebellum. Within the white matter of the cerebellum, we find clusters of nerve cell bodies known as the intracerebellar nuclei. These nuclei are extremely important because they serve as relay centers for cerebellar output. The most prominent among them is the dentate nucleus. This nucleus is the largest. It is situated the most laterally, and it is also considered the latest to appear in the course of evolution. On cross-section, it looks like a crumpled bag with an opening toward the midline. Apart from the dentate nucleus, there are three other important nuclei: the emboliform nucleus, the globose nucleus, and the fastigial nucleus, which lies closest to the midline. On this slide, we are looking at a cross-section of the cerebellum along with the superior part of the pons. One structure that is very clearly demonstrated here is the dentate nucleus.